Well, if you've been with us over the last few weeks, and you know that we are in the middle of a sermon series on the biblical book of First Peter. Now, what we call a book was actually a letter or an epistle. As the name suggests, this letter was written by Peter. And Peter, you probably know, was the most popular and most influential of Jesus's 12 disciples. Read through the Gospels, you will see that Peter's name always comes first whenever the 12 disciples' names are listed. Now, Peter writes his letter many years after Jesus has ascended into heaven. So in all likelihood, we are now probably several decades removed from Peter's years as a disciple when he was physically and literally walking with Jesus. Peter's letter is written to fellow Christians, to fellow followers of Jesus. And so if you've been with us for the first part of our series, then you know the troubles that these early Christians were enduring. As we've studied the letter, we've seen that the Christians to whom Peter wrote faced severe persecution because of their faith in Jesus. Facing the threat of prison or even of martyrdom, these Christians had fled their homes and they had moved to other parts of the Roman Empire where their faith was less likely to be met with violence. But running from persecution, of course, was costly. Peter's readers had lost their homes and much of their property. They had left family and friends behind. They had shattered their social networks in a culture where having a social network was a key to security and prosperity. They were trying to learn languages and cultures they were unfamiliar with. They were living as refugees in foreign lands. And so Peter knew that his readers were discouraged, and Peter wrote this letter of First Peter to encourage them to keep following Jesus. In particular, Peter wanted to remind his readers to keep following Jesus by continuing in holiness. Holiness is one of the key themes of First Peter. And as we've gone through First Peter, we've seen what holiness is. Peter gave us a two-part definition that was of holiness that was best summarized in a verse we looked at last week. 1 Peter 2:11, Peter wrote these words, "Dear friends, I urge you as foreigners and exiles to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul." So according to that verse, holiness is about two things. It's about abstaining from sinful desires. In other words, holy people know their hearts are not to be trusted. We know that we have a tendency to desire things that are bad for us, right? And so we should put those desires to death. And then holiness is also about living in a way that is different from the world. A holy person doesn't go along with the crowd. Instead, a holy person obeys God's words and God's command and follows the path less taken. This idea of holiness is often lost in the Christian community. Too often today, many Christians are determined to copy the world rather than differentiate themselves from the world. And so maybe churches fly gay pride flags rather than submitting themselves to God's teaching about homosexual behavior. Or maybe they celebrate other things that God doesn't celebrate in his word. Holiness means that we who are Christians will stand out. If we are copying the lifestyle of people around us, if nobody can tell us apart from non-Christians, then we are probably not being holy. And so as we've gone through First Peter, Peter has reminded his readers and us that we are to be holy. And last week, Peter reminded us that the holy lifestyle is not an easy lifestyle. As Christians, we see holiness as a good thing, but the culture around us doesn't always appreciate holiness. When we live in a way that is different from the culture, we will be accused of being bad people. Our culture considers its own values good and proper. And as Christians, we don't always align with the values of our culture. Sometimes we do, but not all the time. Sometimes there's a gap between God's values and the world's values. And when we don't align with our culture considers us to be bad people. They consider us out of touch or backwards. And thus we'll be accused of doing evil even when we are trying to do good by the Spirit's power. Last week, we saw why Peter's readers were considered evil by the surrounding society. We learned the lesson from history, not from the text. Right? Last week, we saw the citizens of the Roman Empire worship many gods. They considered the worship of gods to be necessary for human survival. Good crops, fertility, favorable weather, all those things depended on devotion to the gods. And you remember we said last week that Christians didn't worship the Roman gods. They believed there was only one God. And so pagan Romans believed that by refusing to worship the many gods, the Christians were undermining their society. They were opening the world up to famine, flood, and fire. They were preventing the world from being blessed. And then Romans were also upset with Christians because they thought they weren't loyal citizens. The Romans worshiped their emperor. They proclaimed that Caesar was Lord, but the Christians didn't do that. Christians refused to worship the emperor and to proclaim him as Lord because they said Jesus was Lord. And so the Romans thought every Christian was a potential traitor. They accused Christians of being evil because they thought they didn't follow empire and emperor. And today, we who follow Christ are often considered evil for different reasons. Today, we as Christians are called intolerant, bigoted, homophobic, hateful, because we oppose some of the sexual morality of our world. We think the sex should be reserved for marriage. We think homosexual behavior is out of bounds for followers of Jesus. We believe that God created male and female and that gender is a gift from God, not something that we can change by our deepest desires. As Christians, we think abortion is wrong because abortion is the taking of a human life. And because of all of those things, the world calls us misogynistic. They call us arrogant. They call us angry and resentful. For the good that we try to do, we are called evil. Now, as Christians, we try to win people to Jesus. We want to preach the good news of Jesus so that people can come to know Jesus in a true and personal way. When people think we are evil, they don't care about what we have to say. And so we said last week, having a bad reputation presents a real problem for our Christian mission. And last week, Peter gave us instruction about how to overcome the negative reputation that our faith can bring. So last week in 1 Peter 2:11 through 3:7, we saw that we can win admiration for Christ and for Christianity by being good citizens, by being good employees, and by being good spouses. Now, last week, we looked at two of those three commitments. Last week, we saw how as Christians we can be good citizens. We also saw how as Christians we can be good employees. And this week, we're going to look at the third of our three Christian commitments by seeing how those of us who are Christians and are married can be good spouses. And so in 1 Peter 3:1 through 7, Peter speaks about how Christian husbands and wives should act. So open your Bibles to 1 Peter 3:1 through 7 in your Bible apps. I know we read these verses last week, but we are going to read them again and we are going to refresh our memory. Now, let me say one thing before we read these verses. At first blush, there is a lot in these verses that will sound offensive to 21st century ears. There are a lot in these verses that might initially make us think that the modern critics of Christianity are right. As you first hear these verses, you might think that Christianity is a misogynistic religion. You might think it's a religion that hates women. As we read these verses, we're going to be tempted to make some snap judgments. But don't judge the book here by its cover. Resist the urge to make snap judgments about what Peter is saying. Now, there's no doubt about one thing. There's no doubt that Peter's words here are definitely countercultural from our 21st century perspective. But when we study Peter's words closely, we will see that they are not misogynistic. In fact, the truth is quite the opposite. And so before we even read the passage, consider the first word of verse 1. In English, the first word of verse 1 is wives. So in these opening verses, Peter addresses wives directly. Now, to us, that fact's unremarkable. Who cares that Peter addresses wives directly? I mean, in our culture, speakers and authors address women directly all the time. But it was not that way in Peter's culture. Now, in Peter's time, many men, and it was all men back then, wrote about the ideal family. They did what Peter is doing here. Many men wrote about the roles of husbands and wives. So Peter's not unique in addressing those subjects. But in those writings about family responsibilities, those male authors almost never address women directly. Instead, all of the words about households were written to and for men. And so Peter shows that he values women from his very first word. Right away, Peter gives value to women by addressing them. Peter addresses women as competent moral agents who could understand the wisdom of his advice and heed it. Now, that last sentence sounds very paternalistic to our modern ears. What do you mean women are moral agents? Of course they are, right? But Peter gave women the dignity of personhood, of free will, and of moral competency that they did not always have in his society. So right from the beginning, Peter is taking a pretty progressive view of women for his day. Now, again, these verses may not sound progressive to us when we read them, but when you really study them, you will see that these verses gave women a dignity and a worth that they rarely had in the first century. So now you're ready to read these verses after all of those words? Let's hear what Peter had to say about wives and husbands. Look at 1 Peter 3:1 through 7. It says, wives in the same way, submit yourselves to your own husbands, so that if any of them do not believe the word, they may be won over without words by the behavior of their wives, when they see the purity and reverence of your lives. Your beauty should not come from outward adornment, such as elaborate hairstyles and the wearing of gold jewelry or fine clothes. Rather, it should be that of your inner self, the unfading beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is of great worth in God's sight. For this is the way the holy women of the past who put their hope in God used to adorn themselves. They submitted to their own husbands, like Sarah, who obeyed Abraham and called him her Lord. You are her daughters if you do what is right and do not give way to fear. Husbands, in the same way, be considerate as you live with your wives, and treat them with respect as the weaker partner, and as heirs with you of the gracious gift of life, so that nothing will hinder your prayers. Now, I know that these words are tough for many of us to read, right? Because we live in a culture that is fiercely devoted to the equality of men and women. We live on the other side of the equal rights movement from Peter. So there are things here that sound deeply offensive to us. Wives should submit to their husbands. Wives should call their husbands Lord, or maybe better translated, master. Should wives call their husband master? Women are the weaker vessel compared to men. Many women in our society would feel their blood pressure go up just from reading this passage, let alone from seeing this passage implemented. And so at face value, the passage seems shockingly backward and retrograde. But before we criticize this passage, we have to make sure that we truly understand what Peter is saying. And as we start to study this passage, note where Peter's emphasis is. As Peter writes these words, he is addressing all Christian marriages. But Peter puts an emphasis on a particular type of marriage. Peter puts his emphasis on a marriage where a Christian wife is married to a non-Christian husband, right? In verse 1, Peter tells wives to submit to their husbands. Note that this talk of submission is not new. In 1 Peter 2, Peter told all Christians, men and women, to submit themselves to certain human authorities. So in 1 Peter 2:13, Peter told men and women to submit themselves to the government. In 1 Peter 2:18, Peter told slaves or employees, both men and women, to submit themselves to their masters. So note, submission is not just a female thing. It's not a wife thing. Submissiveness is a Christian virtue that is meant to be present in many relationships of different types. Peter is not imposing a burden on women he wouldn't impose on men. Both men and women are to be submissive in certain contexts. But back to 1 Peter 3:1. Peter tells wives to submit to their husbands, and then he puts particular emphasis on Christian wives submitting to non-Christian husbands. Right, the bulk of Peter's words seem to be addressed to a Christian woman who is married to a non-Christian man, right? Look at verse 1 again. In verse 1, Peter refers to husbands who do not believe the word. What is the word that Peter is speaking of? The word he's speaking of is the gospel. And so Peter says it is particularly important for Christian wives to submit to non-Christian husbands, to husbands who haven't accepted the gospel. Why? Now, before I even answer that question, let me backtrack for a moment. Because I know what somebody's probably thinking. Somebody's probably thinking, wait a minute, I thought a Christian wasn't even supposed to marry a non-Christian. I mean, in the Old Testament, there were all these commands about not marrying outside of the people of Israel. And in the New Testament, Paul wrote these famous words. Remember 1 Corinthians 6:14, do not be yoked together with unbelievers, for what do righteousness and wickedness have in common? Or what fellowship can light have with darkness? Now, those words are not specifically about marriage, but I think they're often used to apply to marriage in a way that is right and acceptable. The commitments of a Christian and non-Christian are generally incompatible. And so it might be correct to say that Christians should not marry a non-Christian. But remember, right, that not everybody becomes a Christian before they get married. You know, some of you became Christians after you were married, and your spouse was not yet a Christian. And so you didn't marry a non-Christian, but you found yourself married to a non-Christian. That's the situation Peter is addressing here. The Christian men married to the Christian women, married to Christian men were likely already married when they became Christians. And so Peter is giving advice about how to handle that situation. And the reason he's doing it is in the Roman world, women who became Christians after getting married found themselves in a particularly difficult spot. To understand the difficulty these women found themselves in, we have to remember what we said before. Remember, we said before, the Roman world worshiped many gods. There were dozens, if not hundreds of gods in the Roman world. So if you had dozens or hundreds of gods, how did you know which god to devote yourself to? I mean, you couldn't really honor all the gods. That would be a pretty massive commitment, right? So how did you pick like the 3 or 4 gods that you would really worship? Well, the answer was just like in real estate. It was location, location, location. In the Roman world, gods are often associated with certain places and location. And so the region you lived in probably determined the god that you worship. Now, that's easy enough, right? But what if a married couple weren't from the same location? What if a husband and wife were from different regions and different places? What if on the basis of their birthplace or the basis of the growing up place, a husband and wife had different gods coming into the marriage? What happened then? We understand that question because we still have interfaith marriages today. You know, someone who's Jewish might marry someone who's Catholic. How do they raise the kids? What faith do the children follow? These questions in the Roman Empire were similar to the questions that people answered today. Now, in our culture, we don't have a firm answer for that question, right? There's no established protocol for figuring out what religion should be adhered to in interfaith marriage. But in the Roman world, there was a definite answer to this question. In the Roman world, the gods of the husband always took precedence. And so in the Roman world, husbands were urged to make sure that their wives worshiped their God. In ancient times, the husbands were warned about letting their wives spoil or taint the religious devotion of the family. And in particular, husbands were warned about not letting their wife be swayed by some new religion or new cult. Christianity wasn't the only new religion that swept through the Roman Empire. There was a cult of Isis, you've heard of her before, the god, and that drew many women in. And husbands were warned about letting their wives succumb to such groups. So in the Roman world, how did a husband establish his authority? He established it by being the spiritual leader. Now, that sounds weird to our Christian ears because we don't think of false gods as very spiritual, but you know what I mean. The religious direction for the family was set by the husband by assuring that his gods were worshipped. So you could see what this meant for wives who converted to Christianity. Conversion put wives in a precarious position when their husband did not convert too. And so when a wife wouldn't worship her husband's idols, she was seen as a rebel against her husband's authority. She was seen as challenging her husband's leadership. Thus, many Romans became convinced that Christianity was bad for marriages. They thought that Christianity challenged the husband's authority in his home. To most Romans, Christianity seemed anti-family and anti-marriage. And many Christian wives lived in fear that their husbands would divorce them or abandon them because of their newfound faith. Now, clearly, right, a wife could not submit to her husband by worshiping his gods. Worshiping idols was a violation of the first commandment, a violation of Christian conscience. So what should a Christian woman do to make sure she was committed to her husband? What should she do to make sure that Christianity wasn't condemned as anti-family? Well, Peter says a Christian wife should demonstrate her commitment to her husband and to her family by letting her husband lead in other areas. A Christian wife needed to show her refusal to worship her husband's gods was not a disrespect for her husband's authority. By her behavior and demeanor, a Christian wife separated one refusal from the other. And so refusing false gods was not refusing a husband's leadership. So Peter does talk about a wife's submission to her husband. Right? The Romans saw a woman's conversion to Christianity as a problem of submission. They would have seen a woman's conversion as a crisis of household authority. And the call to continued submission is meant to address that crisis. But note the emphasis here is not only on submission. I'm not even sure here the emphasis is primarily on submission. Peter puts a lot of emphasis on the character of a godly wife. He says the best way for a Christian wife to win a non-Christian husband is to be obedient to God and to live a whole godly life. Peter says that a wife makes herself attractive to her husband through her inner beauty and not through her outer beauty. You know, it's funny. I find it sort of ironic that modern culture tries to define Christianity as misogynistic based on passages like this. Now, I get it. We've already talked about the elements here that make our society uncomfortable. But think of how our society typically judges women. Our society often judges women solely on the basis of their physical appearance, right? I mean, let's be honest. In our society, women are often treated as sex objects, treasured only for their physical beauty and their bodily features. Just think of the ubiquity of pornography in our culture, right? The message of pornography is that a woman is all face and all body. Who the woman is on the inside doesn't matter. Inner qualities are unimportant. Women in our culture sometimes are only seen as a subject of male desire here to give men pleasure. Now, that is misogynistic. That is hateful of women, right? That is an approach that is abusive and reductionistic. Note how different Peter's approach is. To Peter, women aren't just bodies. To Peter, the beauty of a woman comes not from external things. Instead, it comes from her internal character. For Peter, the beauty of a woman is not found in what she looks like. Instead, the beauty of a woman is found in who she is. Does that sound misogynistic? I don't think so. Peter is judging men and women by the same standard. It is the character and the relationship with Christ that matters for both. And so how does a Christian wife defend the reputation of Christ and Christianity when married to a non-Christian husband? She becomes a beautiful person on the inside. She has a character that is winsome and loving and attractive to her husband. Look back at the second half of verse 1 into verse 5, right? Peter starts by referring to non-Christian husbands, saying they may be won over without words by the behavior of their wives when they see the purity and reverence of your lives. Your beauty should not come from outward adornment, such as elaborate hairstyles and the wearing of gold jewelry or fine clothes. Rather, it should be that of your inner self, the unfading beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is of great worth in God's sight. For this is the way the holy women of the past who put their hope in God used to adorn themselves. Now let's talk about verse 3. Is Peter saying Christian women shouldn't wear fancy hairstyles? Is Peter saying Christian women are prohibited from wearing jewelry? Is Peter saying that Christian women should not wear designer gowns and clothing? No, I don't think that's what Peter is saying at all. I don't know. Are there any designer gowns here today with the impending snowstorm? Probably not. Nobody's wearing Vera Wang this morning, right? Okay. No designer gowns. But I think we have both men and women who are wearing jewelry today. And that's okay. Peter doesn't say don't wear jewelry or don't wear fine clothes. No, what does he say? Don't think your beauty comes from those things. Don't think your husband will find you attractive because you look like a magazine cover. Peter is telling Christian wives that their husbands will be won to the faith by godly character, not physical appearance. And what type of character does Peter put emphasis on here? He puts emphasis on a gentle and quiet spirit. Now, again, man, that makes us uncomfortable, right? It doesn't suit our 21st century ears to be told that women should have a gentle and a quiet spirit. I mean, is Peter saying that women should be like children? Is he saying women should be seen and not heard? Why does Peter emphasize gentle and quietness when speaking of how a woman is attractive to her husband? Well, let's note a few things here. First, we should know gentleness and quietness are required of all Christians, men and women. No Christian is exempt from being gentle or quiet because of their gender. Read through the pastoral epistles sometime, the letters that Paul wrote to Titus and Timothy. In the pastoral epistles, Paul gives Timothy and Titus commands about how they are to lead and to evangelize their communities. He commands them to oppose false teachers. And over again, he tells Timothy and Titus to be gentle. He tells them not to be argumentative. He tells them not to quarrel with their opponents. Gentleness and quietness are marks of Christians, not just of Christians who are women. They are marks of all Christians, men and women alike. So Peter isn't singling women out to be gentle and quiet, but he recognizes that these qualities of women would have been especially appreciated in the Roman world. In Roman culture, women were valued for their reserve and for their compassion. The Bible scholar Craig Keener talks about traits that the Romans valued in women. Keener says that traditional Roman matrons were portrayed as submissive, supportive, subservient, and sometimes silent. In much of Roman culture, that was the ideal woman. And Peter recognizes that these lists of qualities overlap with the Christian ideal. And so Peter emphasizes gentleness and quiet for Christian women who are married to non-Christian husbands. He knows that this will undercut the accusations being made against Christianity. Christian wives can't be accused of undermining their husband's authority and of upsetting their homes when they're demonstrating the Christian virtues of gentleness and quiet. Well, they could be accused, I guess, but the accusations would be laughable. The accusations would never stick. So let's think about what we've seen so far. We've seen that the call to submission is not unique to women. Christian men are also called to submit to their government and their bosses. The call to gentleness and quiet is not unique to women. Christian men and women are explicitly called to be gentle and non-argumentative. People want to accuse Peter of misogyny, but in fact, he is calling men and women to the very same behavior and characteristics. The gulf between men and women is not what it is made out to be. There is significant overlap between men and women. And again, Peter is writing to women whose conversion to Christianity could create significant trouble in their marriage. Peter points to the Christian values that will help keep these women's marriages intact. And so that's a summary of what we've seen so far. And now I know what some of you are thinking. Some of you are thinking, well, Pastor, are you saying there is no difference between the roles of men and women in marriage? Are you saying that wifely submission to husbands was a concession to Roman culture and not a biblical mandate? In other words, did Peter call women to submission simply to protect the role of Christianity in society, or is the authority of a husband part of God's design for marriage? And Peter gives us the answer in verse 4. Look there again. Peter writes, rather it should be that of your inner self, the unfading beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is of great worth in God's sight. Those words at the end of verse 4 are important, right? Because Peter says that a Christian's wife's submission to her husband is of great worth in God's sight, right? You can't miss that. A gentle and quiet spirit in a woman are of particular worth in God's sight. Why would that be? Why does God value this wifely submission? Why does God commend it? Because it is part and parcel of God's design for marriage. God has appointed men to be heads in their household. It's not just a Roman thing, it's a God thing. God created us. He designed the relationship between men and women. As our creator, God knows the best way for us to live. A husband's leadership was not just a Roman culture thing. Verses 5-6 demonstrate that. Look at 5-6 again. It says, for in this way, the holy women of the past who put their hope in God used to adorn themselves. They submitted themselves to their own husbands like Sarah, who obeyed Abraham and called him her Lord. You are daughters if you do what is right and do not give way to fear. And so in these verses, Peter goes back to the Old Testament to find the type of thing he's talking about. Peter goes all the way back to Sarah to find an example of women who lived in submission to her husband. Sarah and Abraham lived thousands of years before Roman culture. The Roman Empire didn't even exist. You know, their story is told to us in the book of Genesis, the book that gives the story of human creation. And so Peter is taking us all the way back to the first book of the Bible to remind us what God's design was for the family. And here is where the Bible stands apart from our culture. Our culture hates the quote-unquote patriarchy. Our culture hates the fact that the Bible teaches male leadership in a marriage. Our culture says marriage should be a partnership. No one should be in charge of a marriage. All decision-making should be shared. You see, our culture assumes that male leadership means male dominance. Our culture assumes that male leadership means abuse. Our culture assumes that male leadership means tolerating no dissent, that it results in my way or the highway. But our culture misrepresents the Bible's teaching on marriage, because the Christian view of marriage is, in fact, more like partnership than patriarchy. You say, but how can that be? The Bible prescribes male leadership. How can that be a partnership? Well, let Paul explain, because Paul, like Peter, also wrote about marriage. He wrote some very famous words about Christian marriage. The words begin in Ephesians 5:22-24. This is what Paul wrote. He wrote, wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as you do to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, of which he is the Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. Okay, those verses aren't helping my argument very much, are they? They still sound sort of patriarchal. But let's continue to see what a husband's leadership looks like, verses 25-29. Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish, but holy and blameless. In this same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. After all, no one ever hated their own body, but they feed and care for their body, just as Christ does the church. Now, Christ is the Lord of the church. He is the leader of the church. And how did Christ reveal himself to be Lord? Did Christ stage a revolution? Was there a military coup that he led? Does Christ dominate us with fear and force so that we will fear him? No, not at all. Paul tells us in verse 26 that Christ gave himself up for the church. We know what that means. Christ suffered a horrific death on the cross, and he spent 3 days in the grave that we might be forgiven. So in the Christian world, leadership isn't about forced submission. It isn't about power and domination. Instead, it is about sacrifice. In Mark 10, Jesus said that his followers lead by becoming the slaves of other people. In Mark 10, Jesus said anyone who wants to be in a position of authority has to become a slave of all. And non-Christians misunderstand Christian marriage as patriarchy because non-Christians misunderstand Christian leadership. Christian leadership is not about domineering people and bossing them around. Christian leadership is about loving people through great self-sacrifice. And leadership is costly. Leadership means laying aside your interests for the good of the people you are leading. And so if you're like a Christian man and you're sitting in church today thinking, preach it, pastor, you tell those wives to submit to their husbands, you don't get it. Because you don't lead your wife by telling your husband what to do. You don't lead your wife by demanding she cook dinner when she's tired or ironing your shirts when she has other things to do. No, you lead your wife by cooking dinner for her, even though you might be tired too. You iron your own shirts. You value her opinion and you consider her interests. You put her welfare above your own. You serve and love her so that when the tough decisions have to be made, she yields to your leadership because she knows how much she cares about you. Not because you forced her to, but because she wants to. Your job as a Christian husband is to love and serve your wife so much that it's natural and easy for her to follow you. That is not patriarchy, that is sacrifice. And a Christian marriage is two people loving each other so that each person can fulfill their God-given roles. Right back in 1 Peter, Peter talks about a husband's duty in verse 7. Look at 1 Peter 3:7 again. He writes, husbands, in the same way, be considerate as you live with your wives and treat them with respect as the weaker partner and as heirs with you of the gracious gift of life, so that nothing will hinder your prayers. Peter says husbands are to prioritize consideration. Now, that sounds like a weak word to us. To us, consideration means to think about. So we might say, well, I considered something. I thought about it. But maybe after considering, I didn't do it. Consideration to us is less than action, but that's not how Peter uses the word here. Here, to be considerate means to put your wife's needs and desires ahead of your own. It means to think of your wife in all things before you act or make decisions. Roman culture did not tell husbands to be considerate of their wives. And Roman culture did not tell husbands to be respectful of their wives. Women were often looked down on in the Roman world. But Peter says that Christian husbands should respect their wives. They should recognize their talents and gifts. They should consider their opinions. They should defer to their wife when their wife has more expertise in a matter. Being considerate and respectful goes hand in hand with loving one's wife like Christ loved the church. And so what do we do with today's message? How does this impact the way that we as Christians live and follow Jesus? Well, I think this passage shows us this morning that one of our greatest apologetics is a Christian home. People today want to say that Christians promote a marriage and family style that is harmful and denigrating to women. The best way to counter that argument is to have homes where Christian husbands and wives sacrifice and look out for each other's interests. We should have homes where we're gentle with one another. We should have homes where voices aren't raised and where peace is the defining characteristic. Now, I wish I could say my home was always like that. It isn't, right? None of us are perfect. But this passage gives us a goal to work for. We need to let Christ shape our hearts so that we can be the spouses that God wants us to be. Some people will hate a Christian home. Some people will always resent God's design for the family. But we were created by God, and his design is stamped on the human heart. And so many people will recognize something good when we follow God's design for our families. When they see men and women happy together, they will realize a Christian family is not something to be condemned. It's something to be emulated. And so if you are a Christian wife, let your spirit-formed virtue be the things that make you attractive as a woman. If you are a Christian husband, love your family and wife like Christ loved the church, being sacrificial and denying your own self-interest. And if you're looking to get married, don't wait for marriage to start being a person of character. Let Christ shape your heart so that you can be a person prepared for marriage, ready to serve and love your spouse. Let's have a word of prayer together.